everybody, and welcome to your very first macroeconomics lecture. This also might be your first lecture in college, perhaps your first lecture online, and it's also mine first online. So I'm pretty excited. Today, this video is going to be about macroeconomic data. We'll discuss how we measure the economy. We're going to answer a few questions. One of the first questions is, why are you in this class? How many of you are going to be economics majors? I mean, maybe a couple. Perhaps by the end of the semester I could persuade a few more. I think it's an excellent major. Nevertheless, all of you are here, and all of you are here for a reason. Let's start off with this anecdote. 30 years ago, in 1988, there was a survey done asking the wonderful people of our country whether or not the unemployment rate increased or decreased under the Ronald Reagan presidency. This is at the end of his presidency. He's been president for 8 years. He was a very, very popular president, but he also was very, very conservative. So 80% of loyal Republicans, when they saw that, they said, yeah, the unemployment rate got better. They're right. What about those who consider themselves loyal Democrats? Only 30% of them got the correct answer that the unemployment rate got better. Now let me ask, is the unemployment rate a political opinion? Is it something you depending on your value system or your political preference, it can be viewed one way or the other? No, it's not. It's a piece of data. You just look at it, look up the data that the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects and the different surveys they do, and it goes up or it goes down. There's no opinion about it. So what was going on? Are the Republicans smarter and the Democrats not as well educated? No. Not quite. Let's move ahead 10 years. We have a new president, a different political party. The survey asked whether the budget deficit got better or worse under Bill Clinton's presidency. And Republicans were far less likely than Democrats to acknowledge that the budget deficit had declined during the Clinton administration. So, what are we seeing here? Partisanship getting in the way of determining facts. One of the reasons you go to college, one of the reasons you do higher education, is to be more familiar with how the world works, to understand what actually is going on, and to see through the rhetoric that gets in the way of determining truth. Why else are you here? Well, we're going to learn some skills. We're going to look at some graphs. We'll be using mathematical models to predict the future, and we'll also use these models to understand our history. Now, the math required for this course is algebra, a strong background in algebra and how to read graphs and manipulate curves. We won't be spending too much time overviewing that, but if you have any problems with it, you, of course, have my office hours, or there's tutoring, free tutoring available here at the University of Houston. The other thing is we are going to learn the macroeconomic vocabulary. You open up the newspaper and you'll find all these technical jargon. I mean, just on the front page of New York Times or Wall Street Journal or any other mainstream newspaper, you'll see the Federal Reserve, interest rate. Just recently, there's discussion of currency manipulation and import taxes, export taxes, and tariffs and stimulus, and the list goes on, and we're going to cover all of those things so you'll be familiar. Finally, this will help you learn how the world works. The world is a big place, lots of complicated things. We humans do a lot of so many different activities, and macroeconomics is a study where we could analyze the whole of what is going on in the world around us. With these skills, this should help you be a better employee no matter where you work, because everywhere you work will be affected on whether or not we're in a recession or we're in expansion. If the budget deficit goes up, is that going to affect your future employer? If the interest rates are changing, is that going to affect whether you should borrow? There's always a constant question of, should corporation buy back their own stock or not? There's some of the tools we'll learn throughout the semester will inform those decisions. Finally, regardless of where you work, we're in a participatory democratic society, and the democratic process relies on citizens who understand policy, who understand the implications of policy, and can have an informed debate upon where we should have our government go. This class should assist you and give you the tools to be a more informed voter. Macroeconomics. What is it? Well, it's big. It's the big one. Micro is the small one. When people say, what is the macroeconomy? Or, hey, the economy is doing really well today. What are they saying? They're talking about the gross domestic product. That is the total size of the pie, the total production for an economy in a given period of time. So all of airplanes we build, or are not building right now because of Boeing, all of the basketball games that we attend, all of the Astros games that we attend, the cooks that we hire to make our food, the services that accountants do. If you add all of the goods and services created in a whole year, that'll be known as GDP. The other thing we are interested in is not just how big is the economy as a whole, but how rich are the people inside of it. So we want to divide all of the GDP that we have by each individual. So this is GDP per capita. Capita just means head. So GDP per head. The average size of the pie per person. So here in America, the average size is approximately $40,000 to $50,000. If you divided all of the goods and services that we produce in a year for every man, woman, child, and teenager, because those are different, you get our GDP per capita. The other thing we're interested in is not so much the average, because that's cool too, but what if someone is like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or Jeff Bezos, and what if someone else is homeless? I mean, the average is going to be some number in between them, and you have these two extremes on both sides, and the average is just not going to tell you the whole picture. So another measure to determine how well off an economy is by studying the distribution. The share of the pie, how much of the pie is up here at the top, how much of the pie is here in the bottom, and how big is the middle class. We also care about the distribution between machines versus labor. Are robots and physical capital getting more share of the income than human beings working and putting in the effort? Real quick, the difference between microeconomics versus macroeconomics. Micro is the study of how people make decisions. You study firms, you can even study industries. Macro is bigger. We collect all of these individuals and we collect all of the industries and we put them together and we see how they interact, and that gives us the macroeconomy. Now, macro doesn't necessarily mean big. If we're studying the United States, that would be the macroeconomy. If we're studying the steel industry, which is very, very large, usually we would use microeconomic tools because it's just one industry. Likewise, if we're studying the city of Houston, Houston's a much smaller relative to a country, but we probably would use macroeconomic tools to study Houston because it is the interaction of many different industries. The new vocab here is economic aggregate. The word aggregate just means adding it all up. So we've added up all the things, and that gives us economic aggregates. All right, why is GDP so important? Here we have a lovely picture of the president of China and the president of our nation. I guess I should make a note. It's a good time to make a note about politics real quick. So I'm a human being, and I participate. I've got political opinions, but this lecture is recorded, so I'm going to try and be as neutral as possible. This course does not rely on your political opinion. It does not. You don't even need to have one because many of you are young. You're just getting started in your adult life. You are adulting now. So one nice thing about the economics discipline is about 50% of economists lean right and about 50% of economists lean left politically. Here, this course is more about teaching you tools and how to analyze things. I care about how you think, what logic you use, whether your definitions are correct, whether you've analyzed the model correctly, not whether you think the government should be big or the government should be small, or whether we should do tariffs on China, whether we should not have tariffs on China. Those are excellent and very important questions. All I care is whatever arguments you do use to make your point, that the logic behind them is correct. So let's go back to GDP and the power of the nation. Here we've got Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. These are the world's largest economies. The United States is the world's largest economy. If you look over here on the right, these numbers are from the end of 2017, and the United States GDP was $18.5 trillion. Relative to the world, the whole world is $75 trillion. And I'm like, okay. $75 trillion, what does that even mean? Well, as we know, thanks to the We the People petition that was set up a few years ago, one of the very first petitions that We the People petitioned the government to do was to build a Star Wars Death Star. And they garnered enough signatures, and according to the program, they had to respond. So the director of science at the White House a number of years ago had to give an official government response to the people's petition to build a Death Star. And he said, yeah, we could do it. He's a science guy. He would know. And he estimated the cost would be approximately $70 trillion. So to give you an idea of how much goods, services, food that the world produces, the entire globe, from South Africa to Nome, Alaska, creates, is about enough to build a Death Star. So if we all starve for the next year and don't do anything else, we could be roaming the galaxy and destroying planets. So the United States is the richest economy in the world. It's a little larger than the European Union, which of course is not a country, but taken together they are a unified economy. China is the second largest nation. It is sitting at $11 trillion, so it is a little less than half of the United States currently. The other nations at the top are Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, India, Italy, Brazil, Canada. Canada is about, for reference sake, that's about the size of the Texas GDP. So Texas GDP is about the same as Canada. South Korea, Russia, Spain, Australia, Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, Netherlands, Switzerland, and Saudi Arabia coming in at number 20 with a little more than $500 billion. So what does this mean? If you're a rich nation, you're going to have power to determine the course of world events. Because we're the richest nation, and we've been the richest nation since World War II, the world has been shaped largely by American interests, whether those are good or bad. So let's compare China and the US a little bit through time. What's been happening for the past 40, 50 years? If you look at the graph on your left, this is a measure of gross domestic product between the US, which is in blue, and China, which is in red. So this is the aggregate, how large is the economy. Obviously, the United States is much, much richer. But if we notice, China in the past 20 years, particularly since 2000, 2005, has been growing very, very quickly, growing far faster than the United States. There's still a long ways there, but if this trend continues, China is expected to surpass the United States within the next 20 to 30 years. One of the reasons for that is all they have to do is for 4 Chinese workers to produce just as much stuff, 1 American worker, and once that happens, both economies in total will produce just as much. To see a little more of what I mean, let's move on to the right. Here we've got GDP per capita. While China is the second richest nation as a whole, if we look at the individual people, the particular citizens in each country, China is still a developing country. The citizens are poor. GDP per capita in 2010 is less than $10,000 a year. Let me ask you, my wonderful college students, how many of you live off of less than $10,000 a year? Very few. I mean, it's very difficult to do, living by yourself $10,000 a year, let alone imagine having a family for $10,000 or $20,000. Having come out of graduate school recently, I can tell you anything less than 2025 with a family starts to get kind of pretty difficult. Let's compare China GDP per capita as a ratio to the United States GDP per capita. So how we measure the axes on the left are, if we start in 1960, you can see it's 0.03. That means one Chinese citizen's income was 3% of one American's income in 1960. And we can see, even though GDP per capita is far lower in China compared to the US, it is growing dramatically. In 2010, the ratio was about 11%. So one Chinese citizen's income was about 11% of the average American's income. Hey, what else does GDP buy you? Let's look here at the picture. There's the nice before and after. What are we looking at? We're looking at the planet Pluto. This is before we sent a probe up there, New Horizons, back in 2015 or 16. We sent New Horizons off to Pluto. It took years to get there. We didn't get a very good picture. And once we sent a probe out there, look how beautiful that planet is. And certainly it loves you back. How did we do this? Well, the United States has a large GDP, and we can afford to spend extra dollars exploring things in outer space that aren't necessary for our immediate comfort of food, water, healthcare, shelter, etc. We have surplus income to where we can explore our outer solar system. Looking on the graph, the top one is space budget, just how large it is, and we can see the United States budget for NASA coming in around $20 billion. Is far larger than any other nation. Second to that is Russia. We have the European Space Agency, France, Japan, Germany, and on down. There's some reasons for that. Some countries just prioritize it more than others, and we can see that with the second graph. This is percent of the space budget as a percentage of GDP, and we can see that Russia spends nearly 0.4% of its economy is devoted to exploring space, whereas the United States is only expending 0.1% of our economy on exploring space. So they have a higher priority, yet because we are a much larger nation than Russia, we can afford to spend so much more money on our space exploration. Curious though, I'm not quite sure, but look at over at Algeria and Ukraine, they spend a significant portion of their economy, relatively speaking, on space. What else can we buy? Well, if we're not buying planet explorers, we could buy guns and military. Another way to think of this is you're buying defense, you're buying protection, you're protecting your interests and influence in the world. The United States outspends all the other nations by gigantic margins. And there's some consequences to this. One, since World War II, we've had a period of tremendous peace and global peace throughout the world. This is in a large part due to the United States spending a significant amount of our energy and resources on defending the world. We protect trade lines. Recently, Iran has attacked the oil trade lines next to their coast, and there's a lot of concern with that. So we send some military, and other, the UK or Japan sends some military there to protect the trade lines. Open trade creates global economic wealth, and this is in part because we pay to protect the global trade routes. So who else spends money on military? China's number 2, as we would expect. I mean, they are the second world's largest economy. They should be number 2, followed by Russia, Saudi Arabia, UK, India, etc. Now notice Saudi Arabia comes in at 3rd, but they were only the 20th largest economy, so they spend a significant portion of their GDP. 1.4% of their GDP is devoted to military expenditure, whereas in the United States, that number, I apologize, it's 14% of Saudi Arabian GDP. So there are 14% of their economy is devoted to military expenses, whereas in the United States, that number is less than 4%. One concern for the future, as we've discussed, China will become richer and richer. Maybe there's going to be a new Cold War. This is referred to, there's a Greek historian who noticed this between the Spartans and the Athenians. His name was Thucydides, and so we call it the Thucydides trap. Here's a link in the PowerPoint to an Atlantic Monthly article from 2015 discussing whether or not the United States and China are going to have a Cold War. Could it be a peaceful conflict? We can just get used to a world with 2 large superpowers, or is there going to be a physical conflict? This article discusses many periods in the past where there were physical conflicts. Think of the Athenians and the Spartans. They got in a little battle, and we've made some movies about it. But we can also have peaceful changes of power. The United States and Great Britain is one example of this. I'm not talking about the Revolutionary War, because America was very, very small at that point. I'm talking about when the United States became the global power and Great Britain, which used to be the global power, declined. That period of transition happened around the turn of the century. Around the late 1800s, the United States was starting to become a world power, and we slowly increased our influence in our hemisphere, kicking German and Italian and French and British interests in the Western Hemisphere and shoving them out. You can think of Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders battling in Cuba to free it from Spain. So what's the future? I don't know. My hope is peace and prosperity. What else does GDP buy you? If you have a large economy, you can also purchase diplomacy. The reason why the United Nations is located in New York City is because after World War II, when we created the United Nations, America produced 50% of the world's output. Today, America produces closer to 20%. Europe had a huge civil war with with World War II. Japan, also large economy, was also quite destitute. So because the United States won the war and because we were incredibly rich, we were able to have influence bringing the UN to be located here. The International Monetary Fund is located in Washington, D.C. Right after World War II, the Bretton Woods International Financial Summit also occurred in New England, highly favoring U.S. interests. If you're interested in the Bretton Woods Agreement, gold standard, why is the dollar the world currency? I've got a link to a great podcast there. Now, this doesn't mean that the United States owns the UN, because clearly we don't own it. However, it can't be denied that the US's influence in the UN is larger than other countries, simply because we're larger. Okay, what else can we buy? We could buy schools. We could buy universities. Where are the world's top universities? Right here in Houston. No, I'm not kidding. University of Houston is a world-class university. If we add up, look at the top 1,000 universities in the world. Where are they located? Over 200 of them are located here. We've got a bunch in China and Japan, as we would expect. These are very large economies. Another way of measuring it, we can look at the average ranking. So this you want to be lower. And if we notice, the United States, the average ranking of, even though we have a lot of schools in the top 1,000, world top 1,000, the quality of the schools that are located here are also very high. And China is still growing. So even though China has a lot of universities, their average ranking of their universities in the top 1,000 is around 650 compared to the US's 300. If you look way over to the right, we have Singapore, which has very high quality universities, just not a lot of them. So what does that tell you? That tells you Singapore is a small country. Well, it is, because it's a city. But it also tells you that that city is wealthy, because they don't need a lot of universities, because there's not a lot of people there. But the quality of the universities they have are very high, top-notch. What is the last thing that money can buy? Money can buy you happiness. A growing field in economics is trying to measure human welfare, not just by how much stuff we create, because that's relatively materialistic, and materiality can buy happiness, but it's not the same thing as happiness. I mean, eating 5 Snicker bars before teaching you guys would make me happy, but it wouldn't give me that peaceful zen as having a understanding the meaning of life and being at peace with oneself, enjoying family and friends. GDP doesn't measure family and friends. You can have 20 friends, you can have 1 friend, GDP doesn't care. So economists, we're not just interested in whether or not you have big boats or a big house. We're also interested in, well, are you actually happy? Are you better off? So what we do is we study happiness surveys. Researchers will go out there into the world and they'll ask people, hey, how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 5? And they really do this, and they find differences. Turns out that if you've had a death in the family, people write lower. And if you've had tragedy, you write lower. And if things are going well, you write higher. Well, does money buy you happiness? Are rich people happier than non-rich people? Turns out money buys happiness for a while. Up till about, and these are $2010, $75,000 per household. If someone is making 30 grand a year and they bump up to 45, they're happier. If someone goes from 45 to 65, they're happier. 65, 75, etc., they're happier. It's around this level that money no longer buys you happiness. Now think about this. Why would money stop buying you happiness at that point? What have you bought now that you have $75,000 in your household? Let's see. You've bought food. You're not hungry. You bought some decent food too, so you're not eating junk food all the time. You can afford not to just eat at the dollar menu all the time, but you can have quality food that makes you healthy, makes you feel happier. You probably, if you're making that much money, you have enough time. You're in a job that gives you vacation. You're in a job that gives you some time off. So you can fulfill other things. You can have a hobby. You're not working 2 jobs. The other thing is that you've bought is you probably have a decent healthcare plan. So if you break your bone, you're not worried about all the debt's coming crushing down on you. And speaking of debt, you probably don't have too much debt either. Whatever level of debt you have is perfectly manageable. You probably own a home, or if you don't own a home, you're in a very comfortable renting situation. All of your needs of life, food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, recreation, they're met at an adequate level once you've reached that amount. After that, they do find on certain measures you could find more life satisfaction, or certainly there's even more freedoms the more wealthy you are. Warren Buffett said, because he's one, surprisingly enough, is the United States second or third or second richest person. He was first richest person for a while. He says his annual budget is only $300,000 a year, which, hey, if you're a multi-billionaire, that's relatively frugal. He lives in a 5-bedroom house in Omaha, Nebraska. His kids went to public school. And then he winks and he says, if you don't include my private jet. So, hey, you could buy a private jet. Maybe that'll make you happier. But according to average surveys, money buys you happiness up to $75,000. I've got some more links here if you're interested in happiness and economics. So that's kind of our overview of economics, macroeconomics. Why is GDP so important? How does GDP affect you? I hope that spurs your interest. Keep pumping away with watching these videos, and I look forward to getting to know the rest of you as the semester goes on. Thank you.